Everybody, it is. I've actually been waiting for this moment probably for 4 years because Manu, you are like the essence of BioSummit. Like your work and what you do is just so core at the heart of values of this movement and our community. All of your work is really built around accessible science, and that's really kind of at the core, at the heart of what this movement and what this community is all about. For those of you that may not know, Manu is also one of my oldest and dearest friends. We went to graduate school together at MIT at the Media Lab many moons ago. Manu, I hope you don't mind that I do this, but when I talk about you, in part because you are just, it's just been so crazy amazing to watch your career unfold over the past, 10, 15 years. I like to tell the story about how when we were first in grad school, you would often come into our lab and basically we would be breaking each other's equipment, right? The vacuum pumps for the PDMS and, all of the early microfluidic devices from the first bubble logic paper that you would make. And so, back in grad school, we were in this basement lab together and we were Manu, both and I, we were working on microfluidics. So we would be breaking each other's stuff and leaving PDMS messes everywhere and just trying to figure it all out all of those years ago. And it has been so incredible, Manu, just like watching your career unfold. And again, it's just been spectacular, all the work that you've been doing. I think, we've always wanted to have you at BioSummit. And, I think the challenges of travel and schedule have always been really tough. But I think one of the gifts in the way of this unprecedented coronavirus pandemic is that we are in this virtual world now and we're able to much more easily engage and share. And so because of that, you are able to join us this morning. And so, Manu, it's such an honor to have you. We are so thrilled. We've been waiting for years for you to be able to come and share your work at BioSummit. So without any further ado, everybody, I'm going to let everybody unmute so we can actually hear the applause. We're going to do that this morning. Can you all unmute yourselves and give a big round of applause to welcome Manu Prakash?
Woo!
Yes, Manu.
Woo! Manu!
Manu. All right.
Woo! Thank you, everyone. It is just an absolute pleasure to be here. It's a little bit early in the morning, so I'm just waking up. I think, I've followed BioSummit for a while. I know some of you from prior work, and I've seen how, not just over the years, but also, especially in COVID, it's been quite remarkable to watch what we all can do as online communities ourselves. But just the sense of community has become such an important part of what science and activism is. So, kudos to all of you to coming together even before a crisis. We have, I feel, short-term crises at our hands, and we have long-term crises that are coming. I think most of my talk, I want to spend some time on just the challenging future that I see ahead and the deep value that I see in communities like yourselves. So thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen for a second. And Dave, I don't have a button for that. Share screen. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
And I want to apologize too, because it is like 5 or 6 in the morning for Manu. So this is, I told Manu, I said, we appreciate you so much, especially because we know it's so early in the morning for you. So thank you so much again, Manu.
No, absolutely. It's, I think I was thinking about this quite a lot. I can talk about COVID. I'll probably briefly just describe, I know we have some time for discussion. So I think rather than just talking about a lot of our work, I'll briefly touch upon different ideas rather than going into any detail on anything. But I want to spend time talking to you all.
Manu, you need to just hit the play button on the top of your deck.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so I think, let me just give you a brief summary of where I'm coming from in a context of what I call frugal science. And then I'll walk through a few sets of solutions that we've been thinking about and then transition really this into a conversation. So first of all, I get a chance to work with an incredible group of young individuals, students and postdocs in my lab, but primarily a global community. And I think this is really work represented by this large group. And I deeply enjoy every single day of interaction that I get to have. But let me just sort of scale and paint a picture of where scientific advances have been happening in biotechnology for a long while. When Dave and I were in grad school and just watching things unfold over the last 10 years, it's been very clear to see that we live in a world of haves and have-nots. And fundamentally, to me, if we don't have access to this technology, we would never be able to translate this into the kinds of challenges that we face on the planet. So principally, the perspective of this work that I'll mention is all based on this plot right here. If you don't think about cost early enough in the solutions that you're deploying, there might be orders of magnitude of people going from 1 billion people having access to that solution to only a few handful, which we've seen in pharma, which we have seen in diagnostics. You've seen the outrageous inequality that has existed even right in our backyards. I think I want to emphasize this talk is not about some far off place that has less resources and hence needs this thinking. This talk is about haves and have-nots that are in your backyards, right in our neighborhoods and are amongst us. So if we don't think about that, it becomes a big challenge to the kinds of solutions that we might be thinking about. One perspective here is, of course, many of you work in the healthcare context. This is a picture that I took in Ghana, and it reminds me every day of why we do what we do. This is a picture of a hospital, and roughly out of 7 billion people, 1 billion people get healthcare in this informal setting. 1 billion people around the world have no access to electricity and water, and hence this is their primary. So the van that you see on the left is actually a doctor that comes once a week. And a few of these kids that are waiting have malaria. How do you build and deploy solutions that would operate under a bus stop? You can apply the same sets of principles when you look at just distribution of healthcare. This is from one of our field sites in Madagascar on the right. It takes me somewhere between 15 to 20 hours on the road to actually get to the site where the primary health center is. So if you have a loved one that is sick, you are talking about a 15-hour walk on your back carrying an individual. And this is not a small pocket of a population. It's 1/7 of the world's population lives farther away from healthcare centers around the world. You can think of this in the context of education. I think when you look at education and you ask ourselves a question about who is going to be amongst 2 billion kids on the planet, we share this planet with almost 1 billion kids that would qualify living under families that would be under the poverty line. If you're going to inspire people, which I know many of you do, you have to think about this population because this is half the world's talent to begin with. And if I was to sort of extend this crisis further, which is, of course, I gave you a human-centric view to this, we have an unprecedented damage that is happening to the planet. And what is striking is not the fact that it is happening while we are sleeping. And when I say we, I mean as a society at large. This paper kind of haunts me every day when I think about 3/4 of the insect population in the world has declined in Europe. And it took us 30 years. This has been happening for the last 30 years, and currently no cause has been attributed to something like this. All of these things, and again, going back to, I know many of you think about environmental justice and environmental issues. Just the mere fact that one of the largest pollutants on our planet, we don't even know where 95% of it actually is, the real dark matter of our society. Donson begs this question that how can we be so careless from a scale of phenomenal access to technology to the very few, and much of that not accessible and applicable to some of the most important problems of our times. So I think this is, I just want to lead this with a challenge, and irrespective of any and all the work that you do, I want you all to think about, uh, and again, I think I have to mention this, especially in a context like this, because we are a community of activists. The rise of anti-science is probably, amongst all the challenges that I described, is the one that I'm scared the most. What has happened and unfolded in this administration in the last 4 years, what has happened around the world in organized movements around anti-science, we all hold the keys to actually tackle these issues. And unless we identify them openly and unless we identify where the problems are, we would actually never have an emphasis on being able to pay attention to these issues in the manner they need to. Um, all of these boil down to, from my perspective, of what I call the grand challenges, and they are in a perspective of the planet. And the only way I perceive to make any progress in much of what I just described needs an inclusive partnership between professional scientists and everyday individuals and citizens. And I know many of you got involved in science in this context itself, so you are one of the partners. But how do we extend and expand the access of the technological tools and solutions that we've been thinking about? A planet is a big place. If we can't measure the biology on this planet, we will be in no way and form have the capacity to really make informed changes, to really be able to make the informed decisions that we need to make. The primary technology that we have measured the planet with has been satellites. And unfortunately, much of satellites, although they measure the physical parameters, the biological pulse of this planet still remains undetected. So to me, much of the work that we do is truly around this point of the biological pulse of this planet. And I know for sure, me just sitting in this room or in my lab will not be the one directly measuring that, because we can't be everywhere. So we have to transform ways to sharing our tools such that they get to people around the world. There are several examples. I want to start with, I know it might be a little depressing too early in the morning, but I thought if there is anything I want to say, this is what I want to lead with. There is a silver line here, which is all of you and the sense of community. I don't know how many of you recognize this object on the screen. Do you all know what that object is? It's a very special, the timing of this is also very interesting because Sputnik was launched around a few days ago in many, many decades in the past. This is one of the very first satellites that was launched. What many of you might not know, that at that time Sputnik was launched by the Russians, the world had no technology for tracking satellites. The world had no means of knowing whether Russia was telling whether it was true, if there is a spacecraft spying everybody. And Fred Whipple at that time, who was at the Smithsonian, was wondering this question. And he started what I believe is the world's oldest citizen science program. It's called Operation Moonwatch. It's one of my favorite citizen science movements. And, so the idea of activism in science, the idea of communities coming together for a global goal is nothing new. It's been done over and over again in an incredible success. What was powerful about Operation Moonwatch is Fred launched one of the largest citizen science astronomy program by shipping telescopes, $10 to $15 telescopes, to tens of thousands of individuals around the world, and they competed with $1 million programs of automated satellites that were not ready at that time. And ironically, what was so beautiful is for the next 3 decades, 30 or so years, these citizens are the ones that tracked all the satellites that were launched. And what I love about this is if you look at these groups from around the world, if you look at this picture in the center, it says Mrs. Lloyd Eisenhower, housewife volunteer sought Sputnik 2. And some of the very first sightings for Sputnik 5, Sputnik 6 was actually made by individuals in these groups who were given a quadrant of the sky. Sky is a big place to watch and observe. And this is not just, you know, people just looking at the sky casually. There was a method to this madness. Uh, Everybody's watching a given quadrant. You record when your satellite comes in and goes away from your field of view. That data is recorded, trajectories are plotted, and then the next day they were told where the possibility of the satellite would be. And for the next 30 years, this was the pulse of the space movement with all the technologies. And imagine the immense power. And of course, we all, you know, I didn't grow up in this era, but I hear what a revolution it was for individuals to be inspired. It was not just the big rockets being launched that people could watch and on their TV. It was active participation that actually led for people to be engaged in the space race to begin with. And you know, I feel the same has been going on in healthcare for a very long while. If you were to ask ourselves from the largest community program of biotechnology is community health workers. This is the backbone of human healthcare industry. Roughly around $1 trillion or more are subsidized primarily by healthcare workers that are high school or less in training, that are out in the world right now, millions and millions of individuals with bare minimum training in biotechnology out in the front lines, fighting diseases like Ebola and like COVID, being the frontline pulse. So this is a picture from Last Mile Health from Liberia. And you know, what I think about is if from a health perspective, and you know, if you ask who is the recipient of much of the work that we all do in developing these biotechnologies, here is an individual that's putting their life on the line with just a backpack on their back, being on the front roads of measuring the most deadly diseases on the planet. This is the citizen science program that I believe that we work for in some sense. And I want to think about tools that this individual can carry in their backpack to actually not let the pandemics like the one that slipped away in our hands happen ever again. And the context here is, of course, how do we make sure that the solutions that we would come up with, we have the capacity to deploy them at scale, to let individuals like Alicia that you saw run with them, come with kinds of applications that neither you or I will ever have the capacity to imagine because we're not filling in those same shoes. And how do we do that not just for diseases, but really for ecosystems? So there is a lot of work that we've been doing in this space that I often call as democratizing the access to these tools. Much of this is published, so I'll just walk through and say a word or two about a few tools, but I want to turn into questions very soon. But let me just show you a few pictures. So one of the perspectives of this work has really been the joy of working with individuals in the field, many individuals like you, who spend a lot of time trying to understand these problems. Maybe I'll describe a story or two. This is a picture I took in Uganda that was the origin story of this object that many of you might have heard about. This is a paperfuge. This has now become a platform for doing a lot of diagnostic assays on centrifugation. Let me just skip this. Actually, maybe just for fun. Do people know how fast you can throw a yo-yo? Oh my goodness. These are two postdocs in my lab. I happen to have affinity for yo-yos. I'm just curious, in the chat, if you could type, how fast do you think you can throw a yo-yo? And we started looking at spinning toys and asking a question, what is a scalable mechanism to actually get the fastest way to spin an object with human power? And the perspective here that I want to describe with an example like this is much of our work has focused on a sense of play, because although all the depressing news that I gave you in the beginning, I still am a very strong believer in curiosity and creativity, and I strongly feel solutions right under our noses. So we started with this very simple question on the flight coming back from Uganda. I started writing down, what is the fastest possible spinning object that you can power with human power? And it turned out to be this little toy, which is called a button on a string. Ironically, later on, I learned that this is also the world's oldest toy. 5,000 years ago, relics of this have been found in Jerusalem, in our culture. And you can think about this as a toy, but you can also ask yourself a question, how does it work? And we were surprised, nobody knew the answer to that. So this is how it works. You can think about any sets of these problems and say, I deeply want to understand this. An object might look simple, but there might be hidden just beautiful insights. And I know many of you that build and develop tools and technologies are at the heart of asking these hard questions on simple tools. But what it allowed us to then do is essentially build one of the world's fastest. We can spin these objects from a G-forces perspective. The highest record that we have is around 120,000 RPM. That would be an equivalent of a 30,000 G-force on your centrifuge at a price point of 20 cents. So in 90 seconds, we can do an anemia test anywhere in the world, which 3 billion people need. We can do a malaria test in 7 minutes, pull out a single parasite, because parasites have density changes. And one of the things that ends up happening, the joy of this work, this is the site in Madagascar that I mentioned. I walked 20 hours to get to. What I love about what you just saw as a moment is also the moment in community bioscience for me. Here is the village chief evaluating a technology before he allows us permission to work in his village. And notice something very special. In this room filled with men, there's only one woman. And that woman is at the back right here. She is the healthcare worker, and she also happens to be the teacher. And ironically, because of her status, of course, she's allowed in these rooms and in these decisions. But one of the challenges that we face is the separation that exists in access even between communities themselves. What was important was this transition in this quick 5 seconds of a suspicious person who didn't get a sense for what is this technology that you're talking about, to an individual with the sense of play actually understanding what might be going on. As many of you build tools, I'm a very strong believer that we have to stop making black boxes. We can't make these boxes and just assume that somebody out there just has absolutely no sense of what's going on. And if we keep making black boxes, we'll keep alienating people from the very technology you want to impart. That led to this context of, once we posted this paper, hundreds of designs have come online. There are 5 or 6 diagnostic tests that are undergoing approval on this platform. And then eventually it's starting to build upon. One of the things that we did is we released the COVID test, electricity-free COVID test on this platform itself that operates on a handheld centrifuge. And again, this is much more about transitioning from going from a solution to a deployment of a technology and ownership of a technology in a community itself. Because once you release a capacity to be able to do, you want to enable your users to actually take them in different directions. Dave, how much time do I have? How many minutes do I have left?
We've got about 10 more minutes total.
Okay, so maybe I want to transition to questions. What I'm going to do now is very rapidly show you a few pictures of puzzles and ideas rather than telling you details. And then maybe in a couple minutes, I'm going to transition to questions. Another problem we've been working on is around how do we know what's out there? how do we know what viruses are being carried by individual mosquitoes around the world? Ironically, we have 3,500 to 3,600 species of mosquitoes. It's almost impossible many a times to morphologically identify them. And I often call this a mosquito bucket challenge. This is an actual postdoc. If you care about ecological sampling, this is a reality of what we live in. Here is an individual in Australia who has just captured around 100,000 mosquitoes, and he has a tweezer in his hand and a microscope. And in the next multiple days, he will be one by one picking them up and identifying them under a microscope. So we started looking at this and started realizing that we just are not building the right kinds of tool to do ecological monitoring. And there are two tools that we have released. One is a buzz, which is around acoustic measurements of mosquito biology, which any of you can download and use. But one of the things that I'll just play this for fun. There is a ringtone that you can download now, which is, I'll let it play. I'll let you decide what you're listening to. Has anybody figured out what you're listening to? Not yet? So what you're listening to is an orchestra of the 20 most deadly mosquitoes in the world. And the point of that ringtone that you can download on your cell phone is the fact that just using a recording on your cell phone, you can essentially identify mosquito species. And that led to a tool called a buzz, which allows us citizens around the world to actually map mosquito species. Now, one of the challenges that we had been working on for a while is, of course, it's important to identify mosquitoes and their species, but it's extremely important to also know whether they're carrying new viruses. For that, we developed a tool called Vector Chip, which essentially is a card with thousands and thousands of tiny little wells that allow us to do molecular sampling of mosquito and pathogens that they carry without ever catching a mosquito. Ironically, still today, one of the techniques that's used in the field is called human baiting, where you go and you roll up your sleeves. So I have often sat down in the middle of nowhere and in a place where there are endemic diseases like dengue, and let me be bitten to catch a mosquito and then do a molecular analysis, which actually is, ethically questionable in many ways because dengue doesn't have a drug or any mitigation strategy. And we asked ourselves a very simple question: can we turn mosquitoes into pipetters? This is the very first example of molecular analysis done on single bites of mosquitoes. So I don't know if you notice right there, that little drop, we turned our mosquitoes fluorescent. You can feed them fluorescent dyes. This is a single drop of saliva, and we can now do molecular and genetic analysis on every one of these drops. So the tool looks like a business card, which pretends to be a human to a mosquito. We leave these outside, and we get pictures like these that allow us to essentially detect what percentage of these mosquitoes, what species, first of all, these mosquitoes are, and which of them are positive of, say, this is an experiment done with Zika infected viruses, and we can actually tell what percentage of these bites are transmitting diseases out in the field. One of the things that I love about this technology is we accidentally discovered that when mosquitoes bite us, they inject enough of their genomic copies in us as well. So we don't actually have to capture the mosquito. We can tell what species of mosquitoes it is directly from that bite itself. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to say a word about microscopy tools that we have released that are accessible to all of you. Many of you might have used Foldscope, but there are two other new tools that we have just released. It's called Plankton Scope and Octopi. and a bitoscope, which is really around mosquito behavior. Octopi is an automated instrument that allows us to do modular disease-based microscopy. This costs around $150 to build. But for the first time now, we can do automated diagnosis of malaria and TB in the field. The reason I'm just mentioning this is a very general purpose tool. It's completely modular because it's designed around different heads. So you can, hack it to do all kinds of projects associated with this. Literally replaces something that you would buy for $50,000. What you're looking at here is a completely automated multispectra scan of a malaria slide. And conventionally, where 3,000 to 5,000 cells were used to identify a parasite, we can image roughly around 15 million cells in 5 minutes. So it's a fantastic platform for any of you that are interested. We are starting to build a network of octopi, just like Fred Whipple had done for telescopes. So if any of you want to be a node in this, especially on the development side of the story, just write to us. Plankton Scope has its own website now. It's another modular tool designed for the ocean. And as I mentioned, one of the challenges with the ocean has always been is how are we going to map the ocean? So we identified another group of citizens that we started working with, which are sailors. I don't know how many of you live on coastlines or have access to a tiny little sailboat. So this is a program for enabling sailors to do both sequencing and microscopy in the field. The first version of this paper is out, so you can look at Plankton Scope or look at Plankton Planet. I'll share some websites. And then in the very end, I just want to say a word about Foldscope. I know many of you might have used the instrument itself, but one of the key aspects of building the instrument, so just as a background, Foldscope is a microscope that you can build, cost around $1.75 now for anybody in the world to have. One of the perspectives that we've been thinking about is we can manufacture microscopes, but how do we manufacture mentors? And mentors are amongst all of you because many of you play these sets of roles. At this point, the Foldscope community is around 1 million instruments around the world. And that led to probably one of the largest microscopy community in the world right now. And I want to leave you with a picture here. So these are pictures from, this is a picture from Chhattisgarh, a farming community using Foldscope to identify pathogens in their plant communities. Here are sailors mapping plankton species across the ocean. Here are veterinarians applying Foldscope to identify pathogens in elephants. This is the first microscopy club in Iraq, in a war-torn region, to really where education has been dramatically disrupted. And then I want to leave you with one last picture here. One thing that bothers me in science, and the reason for us to be thinking about this, is unless we take ownership of deploying and sharing our tools with the widest group of people, we will find ourselves back in the same issue of who is going to define the role of science in our society. Unless we can bring every aspect of society into the fold of science, nobody has to be a professional scientist to engage in science. So this picture to me is both very hopeful because it gives you the sense of excitement that reminds you of what a simple piece of technology can actually do, especially in a life science context. But also it teaches me how far we still have to go because there is still a long line. On that end, I will end here. I'm sorry I took much longer than I would have thought, but maybe if we have time for a few questions. I'll pass that back to you, Dave.
We definitely have time for some questions. So if you all have questions for Manu, why don't you put them into the chat? And then we can call on you to either ask out loud. You can also raise your hands in Zoom. Use the blue Zoom hand raise if you would like to raise your hands. And then we can have a few questions. So I see Kevin Chen. Why don't you go ahead, Kevin? Let me unmute you.
Great. Thanks so much. And I'll be quick and hopefully we have time for more questions. Um, so I wanted to ask about the idea of developing tools and technologies versus the idea of like building schools or building society, where I think in a lot of these cases, we like to have better tools, and then the government or an NGO might say like, well, we only fund like, water, project or something, right? I'm wondering how you've seen that argument before.
I don't see an argument. Science is, to me, access to science is a human right. If you believe that you should be literate, you should also have a deep understanding of how this world works. So I can make as many buildings. That does not inspire curiosity. That does not turn somebody into even just the fact that we have these things around in us and maybe the entire world's libraries right here does not also transpire into understanding. So this is why I think the gap that we are trying to address in science education very specifically is the gap between knowledge and experience. Unless you've run a gel, I don't believe you truly understand how a gel works, no matter how many pictures you've actually seen. So it really is about how do you share the joy and excitement of science. It is not about what you designed that somebody else would, it's about what they would think and imagine that tool to be. So I often feel as a community, we should be in the business of making pencils and pens. A pen does not tell you what to write. It gives you the means to write. And to me, things that people do and engage with these open-ended tools are really at the heart of our exploration in science. And that's why all of us engaged in science to begin with. Yeah, so I think, we face a lot of funding arguments like that. I completely agree with you. I don't think it's a cakewalk. But on the other hand, if we can demonstrate our value, and especially for many large-scale programs, Foldscope, we have government programs around the world where several of them, every single kid in the country is experiencing life science for the first time through a microscope. And we are running large-scale randomized trials to prove and demonstrate its value deeply over multiple years. So I think hopefully these arguments will change.
Wonderful. Thanks for the question, Kevin. Let's go to Belle from Stanford with a question.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Professor Prakash. Yeah, thank you so much for giving the talk. I'm always inspired by how you are so passionate about bringing science to the world. I have a question about creating citizen science programs, actually. What are the barriers of entry to creating a successful citizenship science programs? And what are the skills and expertise required to do so?
Yeah, that's an absolutely beautiful question. And I think when I started in this space, I thought a lot about it and I looked at what had been done, and it bothered me somehow that much of what we were calling citizen science was driven by scientists, driven by a scientist, and actually many times an individual who had this set of an idea, and then of course they wanted to roll out where citizens could help them achieve their question. To me, citizen science is about us enabling citizens to do science. And so I think for a program like Foldscope, we have completely transferred ownership to communities that engage. This transfer of ownership is fundamental for these programs to exist far beyond. If I fall off a cliff tomorrow, I know most of these programs will continue because the ownership is completely distributed. Any individual, say a 10-year-old, can initiate a scientific question in this community, and anybody around the world can actually participate. So of course, there is value of humans helping scientists process through data, but to me, that is not the definition of citizen scientists. So that's what we got wrong first. It is one very small sliver of what could be done. And I think one important lesson to learn in the context here, Foldscope is not a tool. I think what we have truly worked the hardest on is building the community, because that to us was the sense of, because now once you have a community, many tools will come in and go, but it is the sense of openness and in the sense of sharing. I mean, literally, while I'm here with all of you, probably there is around 20 or 30 full scope workshops happening around the world where people are just sharing their passion at this very moment, completely unaware, but I have absolutely no idea. And that level of distributed commitment comes when people really know that they are in charge and they are empowered. So if you're creating a program, think about what does it mean to empower the people that are participating. And you would find that the experience that you might have, although it feels a little bit off the rails, the experience is far more enriching. I have learned so much new science just participating in this community now than I would have ever done if I had tailored this into a program that only allows a narrow sliver of questions. So I think the heart of this is ownership. Who owns that program?
So Manu, we're going to have to end there, but really, this has been such a spectacular talk and discussion. And if you are able to, we do have a Slack. I think we sent you an invitation to it, but any links that you would like to share with our participants, you can also email me and I can put them in there as well. But everybody that's a part of this year's BioSummit is in a Slack together. I'll make sure that you're on it. And if you can share any links and so on so people can engage with you further, that would be amazing. And again, I think all the work that you're doing, both technologically, but then also around leadership, mentorship, education, community and movement building. I mean, it's just so spectacular and so directly in line and in tune with our community and our movements. So everybody, can you all unmute yourselves and just give a big round of applause and thank you to Manu. So Manu, thank you so much again for joining us. This was just so inspirational. Such an honor to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manu.
Thank you.
It's
Beautiful
very
talk.
kind. It's very kind of all of you.
Thank you.
And I think I want to
Thank
close
you.
with, I would love to engage much more directly with all of you, because what you all do is really in line with much of the work that we've been doing. And I think as our role is primarily to enable and share a few paths of what we have done, and if any of you is interested in taking these tools and other tools in your communities, please reach out, because I think we are all stronger together, and our diversity is what defines the problems we'll be able to tackle. So I think, yeah, I'm very happy, Dave, to be invited into this community, and hopefully you'll see me as a hanging fly on the wall from time to time.
Good, beautiful. Thank you so much again, Manu.